Good morning, everyone. Hi.
Good morning.
Good morning, everyone. Hi.
Good morning. So I think it's about time we start for today's day 2 of the conference, Production and Circulation of Knowledge in the Semi-Periphery in the Early Modern and Modern Period. Hopefully some more people will be joining in as the day goes on, and similarly to yesterday's day, we will have 3 panels, and after we hear the lectures of each panel, we will have time for discussions, questions, and remarks, possible remarks. Thank you for joining in to the Zoom. And Jan, do we hear each other? Jan Surman from the Masaryk Institute will be our first lecturer for today. Jan?
Good morning. So you hear me, I see, then everything is perfect. I also have a presentation.
Let's see.
And now you should see also the presentation. Okay, so thank you very much for being here. Thank you very much that I can present a few ideas about circulation, semi-periphery, methodology of it, and so on and so on. Listening to lectures yesterday, I was thinking what contributions what kind of contribution can I actually make, which makes sense in the context of the conference, in the, let's say, context of the topics we are discussing. Because if I would tell you the story, a straightforward story of my empirical case, that would be, you know, I would just simply add one other case to many which are discussed, and probably that wouldn't be that productive. So what I thought is that I will make the case itself shorter and try to propose a theoretical topic for a discussion, more or less. So I will still stick to the question of positivism a bit, to the question of misspelling or mispronouncing rather, but please understand it rather as a theoretical idea or theoretical contribution than an empirical one. And in a way of contributing, I will also try to tell the story of this skeleton, which is nowadays in Vienna. Okay, so as I wrote in an abstract, as you see in the title, it will be about misspelling in Lemberg, about Catholicism, about positivism, and about Darwinism. And this is like an opening, which is connected with one person, with Benedict Dybowski, who is I would venture to say that he is a well-known zoologist. I do suppose he's well-known mostly among Polish language speakers and among specialists. And he was born in the Russian Empire to a Polish language family, then studied in Dorpat or Tartu, then in Breslau, then in Berlin. So he had a very typical career of a 19th century scholar studying all around Central Europe. And in 1862 to 1864, he was professor / adjunct at the main school in Warsaw, which was a short-living, more or less a university in Warsaw. And then there he was teaching zoology, especially being one of the first person who was teaching Darwinism in Polish language. 64, 63, 64, the uprising in Warsaw and the Russian Empire. He gets exiled to Siberia. He gets exiled for 12 years. Then at some point of time, I mean, from the very beginning on, he's doing empirical research there. He's becoming a member of the Russian Geographical Society. And then he actually stays in Siberia, even if when his exile ends, and travels, especially around Baikal, making a lot of interesting contributions to the fauna and flora of the region. And in 1884, he becomes nominated as a professor of zoology at the University of Lviv. And this is where my story begins and more or less also ends with his inaugurational lecture. Inauguration lecture, as you all know, it's a big lecture. Like in the 19th century, like half of the city is coming. All professors are coming. All the officials of the city are coming. And Dybowski, as a a positivist, as a Darwinist, was of course very important, interesting person for many people. So basically, the halls of the university will fall when he was speaking. And what happened that at some point of time, he said a sentence which in German can be say like, weg mit der Theologie or teleology. In English, we should get rid of theology or teleology. And we actually don't know what he said. We know what priests sitting in the first row of the lecture understood. They understood that he wants to get rid of theology. And they understood it that he wants to get rid of theology at the university because it was a faculty. What happened is, if you know the Habsburg Empire, you can imagine what is happening. Basically, one of the dean is freaking out. Of course, the dean, who is a theologist. It goes all the way to the Minister of Education. So here you have a lot of different men who play a role in this story. From the left, I'm just trying to. So the person in the left is the dean of the theological faculty. Then you have the rector of the university, who is a mathematician. And then you have Minister Gauch. You have the archbishop, and then you have Franz Josef. All of them like argue about what to do with Dybowski. First of all, because he's very prominent at the time already. He's internationally renowned as a Darwinist, as an empirical researcher of zoology. He's a very he's a very prominent translator of Darwin and Darwinism in Polish. So there is a big scandal in the city. The university closes for a day, and at the very end of the lecture, I will tell you what happened with Dybowski. But what I found interesting is that how many different stories we have of exactly Dybowski, of exactly what is happening at this transition of a scholar who is working in the Russian Empire, is prominent, and then he moves to the Habsburg Empire and he's still prominent, but at the same time, extremely contentious. There is a lot of conflicts which are happening around him. And there is several ways of how to tell this story, and the way of telling this story, I mean, not an empirical story itself, but let's say the cultural repercussions of it, depend on the mental map of your narrative which you are using. And basically in the 19th century, in the research about 19th century Habsburg Empire, you can encounter two different mental maps, as probably all of you know. One of them, the one on the right bottom, is connected with nationality. It's connected with national language. And the second one is connected with the state. And the second one is actually way less widespread. And by this kind of narrative, I will come in a second to what I understand of this narrative. I mean, it's not really something what I understand as a, let's say, research about imperial science, because the imperial science by itself has a lot of limits, which we can discuss later on. There is also a map which I would call an empirical Latour-made map. I'm taking this satirical map of Europe as a as a representation of this map. I will, in 2 minutes, I will tell more how I see this kind of stories emerging, and this kind of maps emerging, and they are also very, very important, very productive. So basically, if you would like to say the story, to tell the story of Dubovsky, you can, from the point of view of the language of the national community, it is a story of Darwinism in Polish, and this is mostly how the story is being told. The translations of Darwin into Polish, the adoption of empirical material, which Dubovsky is making throughout his career. Of course, there is, a way to add his students. There is a way to add a lot of his travels, and so on and so on. And more or less, we can learn about, how Darwinism was adopted, appropriated in Polish, which is an interesting story. I mean, culturally, geographically, and so on and so on. The story gets a bit more interesting when you start looking at the state borders. And here you have, unfortunately, I will try to show you with a mouse what I'm talking about, but it's not that good visible. So if you want to tell the story from the point of view of empires, then you have a scholar from a Russian empire, even if he's a Polish language, one becoming Darwinist, and then at one moment transitioning to Lemberg, which is a Habsburg city. It's a Polish Habsburg city, but still it's a city within the Habsburg culture of knowledge, and with a lot of limitations about what can be taught. Darwinism in Habsburg Empire comes relatively late in comparison to Russian Empire or German Empire. So basically every scholar coming to Habsburg Empire was experiencing very similar problems as Dubovsky did, whether he's transitioning to Lemberg, whether he's transitioning to Prague, or transitioning to Vienna. And you can, say this story as a story of different empires and different systems of knowledge in Central Europe. As systems of knowledge, we are not really connected to natural languages like Polish language, Czech language. They are connected with a special way, with a special imperial language, with a special way of formulating research programs, which in this case would be like very connected with Darwin, in a mainstream academia would be connected with Catholicism, with other ways of seeing evolution at the university. There is evolution, it's simply not a Darwinist evolution. And you can see similarities between Krakow, Prague, and Vienna. And you see differences between Krakow and Warsaw. So here the difference lies between empires and not between languages. And I will tell a bit more about it in a second, what repercussions it has for the program, for a research program. You can also, of course, have this kind of empty map with which you start doing ways Latourian way. You start with Dubovsky, let's say, with his lecture in 1885, and then are trying to connect the dots, what kind of resources he mobilized to make the statement, make statements, which he did. And then we have this kind of beautiful global history, which will be, running through Great Britain by Cal, and will be, connecting different places, different localities. And this is more or less the story, which and the way in which the maps, like the cultural map, the map of stereotypes, would appear. There are very different maps which differ depending on the point of the departure which you are taking, and on the different resources. So this is like one of the most interesting ways of doing historiography. I would say it's a very strenuous one, but it produces maps. It produces empirical maps instead of presupposing certain mental maps, as the two previous examples that I gave you. the story, in a way, I wanted to connect it a bit to the discussion we had yesterday about Central Eastern and Southeastern Europe as a part of the STEP program, as a part of post-colonial studies and circulation studies. And while I was thinking about it, how to connect it, I thought that one of the problems I have with STEP of post-colonial and circulational studies, I have several points, I would say only one, is that they focus on not on originality in any way. They focus a lot of reception and transfer. And that, in a way, actually makes the direction of the questions which you are posing still innovative, but it actually kind of hides a lot from the originality itself, which I find very disappointing this way. I mean, of course, STEP, post-colonial studies and circulational studies are and very, very important, but I think that now we have, we need some more other input. And I was thinking what kind of points could be made. I mean, also basing on my examples, what is the kind of productivity of Central Europe in the context of global historiography of science at this moment. And I think that there are several points which we can observe in Central Europe, which are stronger than they are in other parts of the world, and which I think we could make stronger in conceptualization of our research. And you see them. The first one is that we have multiple situational hierarchies, which are social, cultural, gender-wise, political, and so on. So we don't really have this kind of binary hierarchies that are very often assumed in post-colonial studies. We have also multiple languages, which sometimes align with natural languages, sometimes not. So for example, in my example, the language of Darwinism in Russian Empire is very different than the language of Darwinism in the Habsburg Empire, although they are both Polish, in my very case. So they are very different languages. We have multiple intellectual alliances, which are also changing very fast, like, you know, different centers happening, different centers disappearing. We have non-canonical, and this is something which I came up with yesterday, that very often the word was, it was innovative because it was belated. And I thought, like, you know, what is happening in Central Europe is that because it's belated, we don't have actually this kind of strong canon as we have or tradition as we have in Paris, as we have in a way also in Vienna, or as we have in Berlin or Heidelberg, and so on, which is of course very productive. And scholars are mobile, culturally, intellectually, geographically, and it's also one of the points that, you know, has very strong repercussions. They are more mobile than they are in Berlin. And these three last points, the multiple alliances, non-canonical and mobile, makes it also a bit complicated to tell the stories in a way as they are told in Berlin or as they are told in Paris, because first of all, stories we want to tell were in a way non-traditional already when they were happening, and also now we have to, you know, find narratives to how to tell the stories and make them relevant in a global condition. And translation, just to make that the last point, for me, translation is a tool or as a method to look at the points of contact. And we can also discuss how much you know, relevance translation would have in our daily research. I mean, I can give more examples of how I see translations. Translation doesn't counter the theoretical method that I propose here. So that would be my theoretical proposals. I also hope that we'll come back to them during the conference and discuss them. And as I promised, I should tell you the end of the story of the cow. So what happened is that Dybowski was given a choice. He was proposed after the lecture that he, you know, will. There's many stories about what's happening. The one I like more is that the rector actually told him that that Dybowski has to stop lecturing. That the minister told that he has to stop lecturing. Dybowski wrote to the minister that he is an autonomous scholar, and if he will be told to stop lecturing, he will simply leave the university. He could do it. He was apparently rich enough, and he was apparently popular enough to simply say, I go to Russia now or whatever, and he would, get a job without any problems. The minister, afraid of international scandals, say like, okay, we will not do anything. And Dubovsky had a lot of autonomy with which he was able to recruit, young students, young scholars. So he made Lviv a hub of Darwinism and a hub of evolutionary zoology, establishing also a very important museum of zoology. And what you see is a stellar sea cow skeleton. The museum had 5 of them. And this particular one was transferred to Natural History Museum in Vienna. So the museum was, a global hub for this very this very skeletons. Like from 27 that existed, 5 of them were there. So the museum is still there, still a witness of the 19th century evolutionary thought. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Jan, for this very interesting paper on positivism and Darwinism and the new ways we can think of that kind of knowledge in Central European context. And now we will move on to the next one, which is by Martin KUHAR and Stella FATOVIĆ-FERENČIĆ. Do we have our lecturer here?
Yes.
Hello, good morning.
I have also the presentation. Hopefully everyone can see it.
Yes.
Okay. I would first of all like to thank the organizers for inviting us to the conference. The presentation itself is the short synthesis of the previously published research, and hopefully this conference will also inspire us to write the review paper dealing specifically with this topic. Okay, so I'll just jump right into it. While working as the director of the hospital for the mentally ill in Pesara, Italian psychiatrist Cesare Lombroso noticed that among his patients, many who had committed the crime had physical anomalies. Together with his disciples Enrico Ferri and Raffaele Garofalo, Lombroso founded the Italian School of Criminology, which set out to identify and interpret these signs of degeneration. Eventually, the positivists, as the Italian criminologists were called, took them to be a hereditary regression to an earlier phase of human evolution. Some criminals Lombroso thought were so regressed that they were born as criminals. The penal reform that he espoused, that he proposed, should shift its focus from the abstractness of the criminal act to criminals themselves as biological phenomena. Despite its failure to overthrow the classical legal school and its notion of free will, as well as the Christian notion of moral responsibility for one's acts, positivism still led to some profound changes in the criminal law, such as the introduction of indeterminate sentencing and diminished responsibility, but it also inspired eugenic movements and the US immigration quotas. Criminological developments in Italy found their way to the neighboring Croatia as well, where many debated about positivism. In this presentation, we will focus our attention on the reception and transformations of positivism in Croatia, mostly among physicians who wrote on topics such as crime, forensic psychiatry, and eugenics. Our argument is that, generally speaking, there was palpable ambivalence towards Lombroso. His influence was definitely present in the attempts to reform the penal law, in the courts, in research, and in textbooks. However, pure biological determinism never found acclamation in Croatia due to a number of socioeconomic, religious, and public health reasons. Several contextual facts are pertinent to our presentation. The first is that up until 1929, the Austrian penal law from mid-19th century was in use in continental Croatia. According to this law, defendants were only able to plead sane or insane. There was no notion of diminished responsibility or some sort of grading of insanity. This caused a lot of tensions between the lawyers and the physicians in the courts, since many defendants then opted to simply plead for insanity. Moreover, since this was a period before medical college and psychiatric specialization, many physicians who testified as experts in the court had limited experience in psychiatry and were thus prone to conflate particularly gruesome, violent acts with mental disease. The second important fact was the establishment of the hospital for the mentally ill in Stenjevec, today's Vrapče, in 1879, which slowly but surely meant the introduction of psychiatric terminology into the court proceedings, eventually giving rise to forensic psychiatry. The third fact is the exposure of Croatian physicians and other intellectuals to contemporary theories on degeneration and eugenics, coupled with the socioeconomic and demographic reality of Croatia. This led to a particular concern for public health aspects of diseases, of crime, of prostitution, and other deviances, while it's also favored the Lamarckian notion of heredity. A case in point is the first Lombroso scholar that we are going to elucidate here, Fran Gundrum, who is also one of the first Croatian eugenicists. Fran Gundrum was a physician from Oriovac in Croatia. He finished his medical studies in Vienna, after which he worked in Slavonski Brod, then in Bulgaria, and finally as a city physician in Križevci, again in Croatia. He wrote extensively on many topics concerning public health, but his most important works are the book Sexual Healthcare, the first sexology book in Croatia, and a series of papers on crime that he published for the most prominent Croatian legal magazine, Mjesečnik Pravničkog društva. In 1907, Gundrum conducted the first and only study on prostitution in Croatia and Slavonia at that time. It was a pioneering study. It consisted of sending this questionnaire to his colleague physicians in order to establish common anthropological features of prostitutes. In his evaluation of the results, Gundrum differed from Lombroso, for whom prostitutes were female equivalents of born criminals. Gundrum considered Lombroso's theory about women unsound because it concentrated on women's inadequacies compared to men. Rather, Gundrum's research demonstrated that a large percentage of prostitutes were in the profession out of economic necessity and due to childhood neglect. However, he could not completely resist the idea of an intrinsic predisposition, and the scientific method he used did not convince him otherwise. Of 207 prostitutes who made the core sample of his study, as many as 40 declared that they had become prostitutes because of the will for lechery. 7 listed pleasure, 25 stated that they liked it, and 35 listed lust. Based on these replies, he was forced to acknowledge an endogenous cause for their behavioral disorder, which was revealed through some stereotypical external signs, showing just how much he basically owed to Lombroso, despite their differences in opinion. Gundrum extended his debate with Lombroso to the subject of criminality. Just to recapitulate, according to Lombroso, there was a substantial subset of criminals called born criminals, and they were considered to be morally insane, not necessarily mentally insane. However, Gundrum thought that the fact that only 15 out of 2,804 people sentenced for crime in 1907 were brought for psychiatric evaluation automatically meant that there was a low number of born criminals in Croatia. This was basically a misreading of Lombroso, who never completely conflated mental disease and moral insanity. But this misreading by Gundrum laid the groundwork for a huge number of defendants pleading insanity on the basis of allegedly Lombrosian theories. Despite the apparently low number of born criminals in Croatia, Gundrum still considered them a threat to the feeling of safety. So on the occasion of the opening of the Buenos Aires penitentiary, he openly called for the rejection of the classic legal notion of punishment as the retribution for the committed crime, and instead opted for the idea of punishment as the means to defend the society from its violent members, a typical Lombrosian idea. In the new penal system, departments for mentally ill should be built in penitentiaries, while a true incorrigible criminal should be like any mentally person exclusively in the domain of physicians. Physicians would be tasked to identify such people in their young age, just when they started their inevitable degradation towards the life of crime. Born criminals should be faced with one of 3 options: excommunication, marriage prohibition, or sterilization, which Gundrum regarded as a novel idea worth considering. For Lombroso, epilepsy was at the center of his notion of born criminals. Such an interpretation of the disease meant decades of stigma of violence attached to the patient suffering from epilepsy. Naturally, those debates on the relationship between crime and epilepsy were present in the Croatian psychiatric circles as well. For example, one of the first physicians based in Stenjevec, Dragutin Forenbacher, suggested that true moral insanity can mostly be found among the epileptics, who also frequently had children with so-called psychopathia sexualis, a condition described most fittingly, he noted, by Italian geniuses Mantegazza and Lombroso. Forenbacher thus introduced 2 crucial ideas to the discourse on epilepsy in Croatia. One was that it represented a mental disorder closely linked with violence, crime, and sexual deviance, and the other that it was a hereditary disease. Forenbacher laid some of the groundwork for Ivo Žirocic, the most prominent Croatian psychiatrist of the first half of the 20th century. Žirocic was twice the director of Stenjevec Mental Hospital, while his detailed evaluations published in the official gazette of the Croatian Medical Association were so influential at the time that he is today regarded as the father of Croatian forensic psychiatry. Here we bring one of his cases that best demonstrates the ambivalence surrounding the positivism. The case involves a 36-year-old farmer suffering from epilepsy who was charged with strangling his pregnant wife in 1893. During the first trial, the defendant was evaluated by several experts. Some have claimed that he was simulating, others that he had an epileptic appearance with closed skull sutures. All adults have closed skull sutures, and still others that he committed the crime during an episode of epileptic absence. Due to these incompatible opinions, the court ordered a proper evaluation at Stenjevec and a retrial. During his hospital stay, Ljubojević was always calm, while his skull readings were pretty much normal. Žirovčić thus rejected the idea of epileptic appearance in this case, and instead concluded that the man suffered from something called hereditary psychosis. Patients with this malaise were capable of extreme brutality, he said, and were predisposed to crime, inebriation, obscenities, and bestiality. The defendant too was such a mental weakling, but whose crime, because of his lesser mental value, deserved to be viewed more leniently. Žirovčić's approach and diagnosis, despite rejecting epilepsy as the cause of crime in this case, obviously reflects a typical Lombrosian mindset. This expertise was used in the retrial, which resulted in a 15-year prison sentence for the defendant. Cases such as these reveal the theoretical incoherence that plagued psychiatry at the turn of the century. Not only did forensic experts have vastly different views on the role of epilepsy in murder cases, but there is even a palpable tension in Žirovčić's own evaluations between Lombrosian determinism and the idea that people have free will, that they are morally autonomous agents. Such incoherence not only resulted in cumbersome, prolonged, and costly court procedures, but it also resulted in injustice for many suspects who had to go through multiple evaluations and repeated court processes. During one interview with Žirovčić, Ljubojević said that he would rather be hanged than tortured like this any longer. Žirovčić eventually recognized this problem, and in 1906, he openly criticized the outdated penal system. The occasion for his criticism was a case of arson by a young man suffering from epilepsy. The man had, as Žirovčić claimed, bulging occipital bone and pronounced forehead, and was clearly a person of lesser value. While some more modern legislations, Žirovčić claimed, recognized the idea of diminished responsibility, which made possible for such people to be declared less accountable, the Croatian penal law was too rigid and did not allow such a grading of sanity. This obviously frustrated Croatian psychiatrists such as Žirovčić, who had limited opportunity to show his true knowledge and substantially influence court decisions. This proposed reform also revealed some eugenic undertones. In one case in which a person suffering from epilepsy decapitated a 3-year-old child, Žirovčić expressed his disappointment that this mentally disabled man had married at a young age and that those with duty to prevent the marriage actually supported it. They were unaware, he claimed, just what kind of sin they committed against mankind. But at least he was relieved that the man's wife left him before they had any children together. Soon, eugenicists would pick up on that idea, supplanting it with numerous warnings on a national weakening due to such people procreating at will. In the works of eugenicists, epilepsy was reconceived as a socially undesirable trait that should be eliminated from the nation's hereditary material. So despite the fact that physicians finally acknowledged that criminal acts by persons with epilepsy should be viewed through the lens of their illness, patients suffering from epilepsy found themselves at the mercy of another idea that they represented people subverting the nation's progress. Probably the most striking example of the uses and manipulations of Lombroso's positivism came in the months following the terrorist strike in Zagreb in 1912, the second in Austria-Hungary in 2 days. On June 8, 1912, 25-year-old lawyer Luka Jukić tried to assassinate the Croatian Ban Slavko Cuvaj by shooting at the car transporting him during the festivities in Zagreb. Jukić failed in his attempt, but killed Cuvaj's advisor as well as one police officer during his escape. He was caught a few blocks away and detained. Immediately after the event, the government and its newspapers tried to portray Jukić as an overly tense man, a man with undoubtedly abnormal disposition, who belonged to Cesare Lombroso's gallery of figures and who attempted an insane assassination. One of the leading Croatian legal experts, Ernest Miller, also writing for the government's papers, commented that Jukić's act demonstrated the tendency for crime to devolve into more primitive forms in time, and claimed that Jukić tried to eliminate an imaginary danger, which suggested that he should either be put in solitary confinement or lunacy or madhouse. However, as the date of the trial approached, it became obvious that Jukić would plead insanity, which meant that the state swiftly had to change its strategy. While at first it was opportune for the government to portray Jukić, who was a revolutionary and a proponent of South Slav organization, as a mentally unstable individual, in order to expose Yugoslavism as a mental deviation, now it was vital to reveal his act as premeditated. On the other hand, Lombrosian discourse was now appropriated by Eugenics lawyers, who claimed that Eugenics' parents were feeble-minded and mentally ill, that he had innate psychopathic disposition revealed by certain external signs, such as attached earlobes, and that the very act of this assassination was proof of mental illness. This is, of course, another use of Lombroso, but basically a misreading similar to Gundrum's, since for Lombroso, moral insanity and mental insanity are not one and the same. To settle this disagreement, Žirocić was tasked with evaluating Jukić during the trial. Žirocić testified that Jukić was a rational man and that he suffered only from constitutional neurasthenia and not a true mental disease. Žirocić was strongly criticized for his evaluation, especially by the Croat-Serb coalition, but also the Croatian Medical Association, which was becoming ever closer to the Yugoslav Union, or by one of the most renowned authors of the Croatian modernism, Antun Gustav Matoš. After this trial, Žirocić withdrew from public eye and stopped writing forensic reports for the bulletin of the Croatian Medical Association. Jukić was sentenced to death, which was later amended to life in prison. He was eventually pardoned after Yugoslavia was formed. Okay, so to conclude the presentation, Lombroso was obviously the focal point of the debates on crime, criminal law, epilepsy, and eugenics in Croatia. His theories were assessed by researchers, practical physicians, and lawyers, while his influence on the practice of the Croatian courts was substantial. Examples such as Gundrum and the Jukić case clearly demonstrate the myriad ways in which Lombroso's complex theories were adopted, critically engaged, modified, or even misinterpreted. To physicians such as Žirocić, who was deeply concerned with establishing the legitimacy of psychiatry through its connection with modern medical knowledge, Lombroso showed the way towards closing the gap between psychiatry and other more empirically founded medical disciplines. It should be noted that during that time, psychiatry was always thought to be a less empirically validated in medicine. So psychiatrists now had a theory that was based on hard data, such as skull measurements, that other specialists in medicine could understand and relate to. And in this process, psychiatry emerged as a medical specialty equal to others. Moreover, psychiatry now seemed capable of performing some of the most troubling tasks in the legal system, such as forensic evaluations. Psychiatrists were able to convincingly assert that their specialized forensic knowledge was necessary to properly and speedily resolve criminal cases involving suspects with mental problems. Despite the strong presence of positivism in legal and medical circles, pure biological determinism never found acclamation among Croatian intellectuals. Mainly due to the difficult socioeconomic context in Croatia at the beginning of the 20th century. Slow institutional development under Austro-Hungarian rule, widespread illiteracy, high mortality, especially among infants and children, all worked against the idea that people were determined solely by their hereditary material, as we have seen in Gundrum. Now, it comes as no surprise that Lembergism was the dominant theory of heredity in Croatia, at least until the 1930s. And as a Catholic country, Croatia was not a fertile soil for explicitly secular theories such as Lombroso to be appropriated in their full sense. Okay, that's our presentation.
Thank you for the interesting paper, for this flux of psychiatric knowledge with legal practices. And now to move on, the third paper of the day is by Vojtěch POJAR. From Central European University. Vojtěch, can we hear each other?
Yeah. I hope we can. So good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. It's a real pleasure, and the discussions are really stimulating. My paper is on the circulation of eugenic knowledge in the Habsburg Empire. I don't have a presentation because it increases the bandwidth, and it has a bad impact on the voice quality. So I will just read my paper. So in Austria, there never was much interest in eugenics. Thus spoke Géza von Hoffmann, a Hungarian eugenicist, in 1929. More recently, of course, historians showed that the polycentric Habsburg Empire was a hotbed of eugenic thinking. Hoffmann also claimed that it was the nation that provided the main frame and object of eugenics in Central Europe. This assumption remains unchallenged so far. I will question this assumption by analyzing the circulation of eugenic knowledge within the Habsburg Empire. I will argue that some eugenicists in the Habsburg context created networks that were imperial in their scope. They also shared some of their underlying epistemic and political agendas. The anxieties stemming from emerging imperial modernity were crucial in shaping these agendas. And these agendas included blueprints that sought to reframe and indeed regenerate the empire. As Knight Sis puts it, evolutionism turned into a metadisciplinary tenet, coloring the rhetoric and the epistemic assumptions of other disciplines, imparting an almost homogeneous appearance to many sciences. He shows that the emerging sociology was one of these disciplines. For most of the 19th century, sociology drew on Lamarckism, that is, on the notion that acquired characteristics can be inherited. Biology and society were entangled for these sociologists. However, as Maurizio Melloni, for example, argues, the rise of hard heredity challenged this connection. While hard heredity was perceived as a challenge to the progressive worldview by some sociologists, to the others, it provided a language to disentangle their discipline from biology. So this epistemic challenge provided a crucial setting for the rise of eugenic thinking within sociology. I will focus mainly on the networks of sociologists in this presentation. Of course, other disciplines, including psychiatry and anthropology, were also crucial for the emerging eugenics in Austria-Hungary. However, it were the communities of sociologists and their allies, including the sociologists in Vienna, Budapest, and Prague, that became key sites of eugenic debates in the late Habsburg Empire. Some of the earliest self-described eugenic associations in Austria-Hungary emerged from within sociological communities. The first one was in Vienna in 1913, followed by Budapest in 1914, and by Prague in early 1915. The earliest of these associations was established in 1913 within the Viennese Sociological Society. Its leading members included Rudolf Goldscheid, a sociologist, Paul Kammerer, an experimental biologist, and Julius Tandler, an anatomist. The association was a culmination of several years of eugenic debates. I will briefly discuss the key tenets of this Viennese eugenics, if you will, before arguing that one of its main aims was to grapple with imperial diversity and imagine a reform of the empire using the theories of soft heredity and mutual aid. For many of these eugenicists, monism provided the overarching framework. One of their key concepts, Goldscheid's human economy, or mentioned economy, drew on monist sources and on Ostwald's energetics in particular. Goldscheid argued that humans were not a resource that could be harvested at will. Instead, they embodied energy that had to be used sustainably. As he puts it in one of his lectures, quote, "The most valuable resource we have is the humans themselves. A truly monist politics must ask why we are paying for our cultural achievements with such a waste of humans," unquote. Appropriating the rhetoric of scientific management and recasting it into a socialist biopolitical project, Goldscheid proposed a social reform whose main goal was to engineer the environment and thus shape human bodies. Human plasticity was one of the core assumptions behind Goldscheid's eugenic blueprint. A new environment could forcefully shape human bodies only as long as they acquired new traits in response to their surroundings, and as long as these changes could be passed on to the offspring. To make his point, Goldscheid drew mainly on the research of Paul Kammerer. Kammerer's research on the inheritance of acquired characteristics is well known, and its aspects have been revisited recently by scholars including Tatiana Bukliaš and Klaus Taschler. Yet, it has so far received less attention that producing experimental evidence of plasticity of organisms was only one part of Kammerer's agenda. It was equally important for him to show the importance of cooperation in nature. Various arguments about mutual aid circulated transnationally, and Kammerer drew to a significant extent on the ideas put forward by Piotr Kropotkin, a scientist and anarchist thinker. Kammerer went beyond Kropotkin, however, in one crucial aspect. While Kropotkin focused mainly on mutual aid taking place among the members of the same species, Kammerer explored the idea of cooperation between different species. For Kammerer, difference was no obstacle to mutual aid, but its crucial prerequisite. Rather than by any kind of cooperation, therefore, Kammerer was fascinated by symbiosis. Crucially, he also claimed that symbiosis was driven by instincts rather than reason. For Kammerer, this was crucial because it meant that symbiotic instincts were a trait that could be acquired and inherited further. In an appropriate environment, every organism could become symbiotic. Now, it's clear that Kammerer's main goal was to apply this theory to humans, and specifically to the ethnoculturally diverse Habsburg imperial context. His paper, Nationalism and Biology, published in early 1914, makes it clear. Individuals and extension nations were like his experimental animals, he suggested. They could instinctively become entangled in symbiotic relationships marked by division of labor and of its products, as well as by increasing intermixture between these groups. This was a clear attack on the national superiority in the empire, partly directed at Gumplowicz and largely on Houston Stewart Chamberlain. As an alternative to these theories, Kammerer implied a vision of an empire as a vehicle of symbiosis, an environment which would incentivize humans to cooperate and ultimately mold them into interconnected symbiotic beings. In order to analyze the circulation of these ideas, it's necessary to question another received opinion, namely that the networks of Viennese eugenicists were limited almost exclusively to the imperial metropolis, and that they reached mainly to local urban audiences. For example, it's often said that Hugo Iltis, a geneticist and Mendel biographer based in the nearby town of Brno or Brünn, was Kammerer's only ally. After all, he worked with Kammerer during his internship at the Vivarium, a biological experimental station located in Prague, where Kammerer carried out his experiments. However, even a cursory look at the list of fellows of the Vivarium reveals the remarkable diversity of these individuals. To start with, several of Vivarium's interns were women, remarkably so at the time when only a few research institutions in Vienna included female researchers. Moreover, the interns came from various parts of the Habsburg Empire, and surprisingly large part of them recruited from territories that later became parts of Yugoslavia, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and Romania. Many of them played an important role in the history of eugenics in the Habsburg Empire and the territories and the spaces that replaced it after its collapse. The diversity of Vivarium's interns, in other words, reflected the diversity of the empire. Viennese eugenicists, moreover, established robust networks within various centers of the empire. Consider Prague and Budapest. There were more, but I will focus only on these. Of course, the sociological communities there were committed to different varieties of positivism than their Viennese counterparts. In Budapest, sociologists subscribed mainly to Spencerianism, while in Prague, Comtean positivism loomed large. Viennese eugenicists became household names among left-wing sociologists in Hungary. The flagship journal, Husadik Század, regularly published papers by and reviewed the work of Kammerer and Goldscheid. Moreover, Viennese eugenicists lectured in Budapest. Rudolf Goldscheid was invited, for example, to deliver the keynote lecture at the Jubilee session of the Society of Social Science, Társadalomtudományi Társaság, that celebrated the decade of its existence. In his lecture, he systematically exposed the assumptions behind his eugenic blueprint of human economy. Paul Kammerer was even more sought after in Budapest than Goldscheid. He repeatedly visited the second metropolis of the empire to lecture at the Society of Social Science, and eugenics was at the core of his talks. Their arguments reverberated with local epistemic and political agendas. In epistemic terms, Hungarian sociologists were divided whether to remain committed to soft heredity that underlies Spencerian sociology. Interestingly, Kammerer's arguments appealed both to supporters of soft heredity and to hard hereditarians. The neo-Lamarckist eugenicist Zsigmond Fülöp, for example, praised Kammerer as a genial Viennese experimentalist, and he was obviously happy about his experiments about soft heredity. René Verković, on the other side, a supporter of hard heredity, enthusiastically reported on Kammerer's arguments about symbiosis. To the former, developmental plasticity helped tone down some implications of his selectionism. To the latter, the emphasis on symbiosis helped eliminate some of the brutal ramifications of hard heredity. In political terms, it was the collective experience of the political crisis that shattered Hungary in 1905 and 1906 that brought the sociologists in Vienna and Budapest closer. Many civic radicals, including Oskar Jászai and Andrija Ady, obviously none of them was a eugenicist, supported the imperial authorities against the newly elected Nationalist Independence Party, hoping that this choice would bring social and political reforms. Indeed, they increasingly perceived these nationalists as the main obstacle to social change and their main political adversary. The agenda of Viennese eugenicists overlapped with these goals. As we have seen, not only did they search for blueprints to regenerate the empire that wouldn't erase its diversity, but they also sought to dismantle the theories of national superiority. It's not surprising, therefore, that Kammerer's paper on nationalism and biology, for example, was almost immediately translated into Hungarian and published by the Husadik Század. The exchanges between eugenicists in Prague and their Viennese counterparts were even more intensive. One of the key issues for some of the key Czech eugenicists at this point was how to make eugenics compatible with Masaryk's ethics of humanity. Tellingly, one of the first texts on eugenics in Czech was written by a sociologist, and it bore the title, "The Ideals of Humanity and the Degeneration of Nations." Ultimately, many of these early Czech eugenicists settled for Viennese eugenics due to its soft hereditarianism and emphasis on social reform. For example, when a eugenics association emerged in Prague, one of its leading members emphasized in his keynote speech, the idea of economizing humans was developed by philosophers such as Rudolf Goldscheid in his book on mention economy. Inevitably, it knocks on the gates of our country, unquote. The framework combining Masaryk's ethics and Goldscheid's concept of human economy was broad enough to integrate multiple disciplines. Crucially, apart from sociologists, the Eugenic Society also included several experimental biologists, and it was the latter group that interacted most intensively with Viennese eugenicists. Goldscheid, Kammerer, and Tandler were some of the key references for these eugenicists. Moreover, they also ran research projects that were not dissimilar to those at the Vivarium, and they corresponded with Kammerer, exchanging their papers and research reports. Kammerer was enthusiastic about them. In the early 1920s, they even considered, they even offered a job to Kammerer and considered launching a mutual research project with Eugen Steinach again at Vivarium. It's not surprising then that their eugenic blueprint that resulted from the negotiation with Viennese eugenics drew heavily on Goldscheid's human economy and Kammerer's arguments about soft heredity and symbiosis. However, what they did was to transfer and in a way adapt this intellectual package by switching the focus from the urban working class to the category of the people, which was both more ethnically charged and which included both rural and urban populations. They also implied that the regeneration of these people is a particular step in the regeneration of the empire. So in a way, it helped them to locate themselves within the imperial diversity. And the histories of biosocial analytical frameworks developed by left-wing eugenicists and their allies in Vienna, Budapest, and Prague are entangled. Eugenics, as a part and parcel of these frameworks, emerged as a result of a mutually constitutive process. Eugenic knowledge circulated within the Habsburg Empire together with eugenicists themselves. Now, what does it tell us about Andrija Štampar's intellectual genealogy? This is just a brief conclusion. Željko Dugatz and Martin KUHAR elucidated Štampar's close ties to the Viennese context. Štampar was a student of Julius Stadler, and Viennese eugenics left an impression on him. In his early essays written either in Vienna or shortly after his return to Croatia, Štampar made gestures towards monism, Cauchyte's human economy, inheritance of acquired characteristics, and finally to mutual aid. Tellingly, one of the least papers Štampar ever wrote celebrated Viennese popular science education, including those institutions that were favorized by emerging Viennese eugenicists. This was not a passive reception, of course. Almost immediately, he started retooling these ideas for a rural context. So what we see is that he wasn't an isolated figure. His intellectual genealogy was a part and parcel of a circulation of left-wing eugenic knowledge in the late Habsburg Empire, which revolved around entangled sociological communities in various centers of the empire. This has interesting implications from the perspective of post-imperial transitions. It becomes apparent that the eugenic discourses that, for example, informed some welfare policies in Red Vienna, Czechoslovak public health debates, or some projects of social medicine in Yugoslavia were, to a certain extent, reframed projects of imperial reform. A part of the expert knowledge, therefore, that fed into state building in some post-Habsburg territories had an imperial genealogy. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Vojtěch. And now for the last paper of this panel by Paulo Henrique Rodrigues Pereira, who is a PhD candidate at the Law School of the University of Sao Paulo. Paulo, do you hear each other?
Yeah, it's great. Thank you, Professor. May I?
Yes, please.
Okay, good morning, everyone. So I would like to thank you for the organizers for the seminar. I've been learning a lot in these 2 days and for the opportunity to have here. I didn't bring a presentation, not because some connection problem, because my brain is not able to show a presentation and speak English at the same time. So I just have my presentation speaking for you guys. And now we can go to then we can go to the questions. So I would like to discuss through a concrete case a little bit about the relationship between law, the idea about the legal knowledge, and its production and circulation. I'm a Brazilian researcher, and I'm currently developing my work in the United States. So I'm a researcher of African slavery in the Americas with a specific focus on Brazil. I have been particularly interested in the regime's what we call the gradual emancipation from slavery. From the end of the 18th century, a wave of law sought to create ways to extinguish slavery in a negotiated way, finding institutional space for the realizations of these regime transitions. These are the so-called free womb laws, which operate in a simple way. The enslaved continues to be held on servitude, serving their masters until their death. However, their children were released, who would then be born free from the enactment of that laws. In reality, they are not so free. These children, the freed womb generation, need to serve their mother's masters for a few decades until they were finally able to regain their capacities for freedom. Legal modeling took place from the perspective that, although they were born free, they need to reward their mother's masters for the loss of capacity they had in managing and raising them. So they also need to make up for the costs of their years of learning, apprenticeship. So those times when they were forced to work, in general between 18 and 30 years old, were seen as being legally justified as debt repayment. So they are not slaves anymore, but they born with a debt to the mother's masters. Over the course of about a century, the freedom of the womb laws is spread across the Americas. Starting out in the north of the United States, then they moved down to Latin America and then into South America. Some countries had long resisted this type of laws. In addition to the economic, political, and social arguments used to attack such a gradual emancipation projects, the law also played an important role in this debate. This was the time of the formation of modern states in Latin America, and as incredible as it may seem today, the worst slave regimes in modern history like to see themselves as a liberal countries. The performance of the defenders of slavery, therefore, held on to a supposed natural right to property in order to attack emancipation. Knowledge of the legal tradition or legal knowledge, therefore, authorized the discourse of slavery. They said there was no legal categories that authorized this division between ownership of the mother and the child. Property is just an integrated thing. So the right to parto sector venturing, that's the Latin expression to mean the generational property of slavery, was defended as an immutable fact of the societies that practice slavery. Denying this form of property would have been to break a long chain of legal rationality established since the old times of Justinian. This sort of argument about the presence of these partos in the Western legal tradition was rarely challenged, and allowed the enslaved property by birth could survive for a long time. So from the beginning of this kind of projects until the last law that was approved in Brazil in 1871, we had more than 1 century about these debates. So my research has shown, however, that's not true. The performance of the natural of legal knowledge and the conditions of the formation of its rhetoric, therefore, need to be analyzed in order to better understand these forms of its production and formation. Law is a practical reason, and as such, the production of its knowledge alters the object. As a result, performance on the knowledge of law changed its practices and also impacted the shape of institutional standards. In fact, the Romans knew the principle of parto sector venture, I will call that partos, so on. And it's true that it was applied to the enslaved people. The idea of a generational transmission of slavery to the Romans did not seem to be a problem. As you know, in general, civil qualifications in Roman law was given precisely by birth. The choice for maternal, not paternal affiliation draws attention. This is because such transmissions were made by men, the paterfamilias, in Roman society. The jurisprudence understood that in case of non-legitimate children, outside the children that was generated outside a legal marriage, the presumption about paternity could not be imposed. So only what's possible to know is who was the mother. As enslaved marriage were always illegal, this meant that legal thought came to understand that children were always illegitimate and therefore should follow the mother's constitution. Marriage for the Romans was an act of will. It represented only legal capacity to decide. not everyone had this ability. In other words, in modern perspective, not everyone was subject of the law. Therefore, not everyone could get married. It so happened that in the transition from antiquity to modernity, Christianity substantially changed the notion of marriage. As a sacrament, marriage was no longer just a legal act, but it gained a kind of salvific proportions. Like baptism, the legal practice of marriage changed and has taken on a new meaning in modern times. The slavery that was developed in America from the European expansion was essentially different than the Roman one. Initially organized by Catholic kings, transatlantic African trafficking was justified as a major process of the conversion to the Christianity. Firstly by the Catholic Church, but then also by Protestants too, who began to regulate the entry of these new Africans into Christian communities. This was a process that had already been taking place with Moors and Jews in the Iberian Peninsula and was become stronger with the new inhabitants of the America, whether indigenous or African people. With regulated marriage and baptized children, the descendants of Africans gradually come to be recognized as members of Christianity. So the arguments for their slaveries gets weaker, and this generates a lot of instability about the part of sector of entry. From the beginning of the colonization in America until practically the end of the 18th century, the slavery of children through the maternal line was the result of many debates, rejections, and attacks. The legal system, the modern legal system, had difficulties in recognizing partus as an integral part of their order. In many regimes, transmission via the father continues. As many of the children of enslaved women were also children of Europeans whites, the disproportion between men and women in American slavery is well known. In many places, the tradition was to grant them freedom because they were children of white fathers. In other places, the very idea of a generation transmission was completely denied. The parents' sins, of course, I'm referencing the arguments of that time, brought from African barbarism were interrupted by the effect of baptism over the children. Other societies measure the amount of the blood. If there was a majority of white blood, they were released. If were the majority of African blood, they were put in slavery. Otherwise, they would find themselves enslaved in a very different types of solutions and categories. So at the end of the 18th century, the European colonial empires made a huge effort to specifically legislate on the part of sector of entry. They registered transmission via the mother, and in doing so, clarify waves of uncertainties and instabilities on the subject. This is known as the era of the Black Codes and specific legislation on slavery. So the consolidation of the partos took place in most of the Americas only a few decades before the debate about indistinction. However, the linguistic and rhetorical exercise of placing such a category as an essential one produced a lot of outputs. It also gave rise to a form of innate natural property, a right that a few decades earlier had been established during a climate of doubt and instabilities. The strategy worked, and slavery by birth lived in America until 1871. So what I mean here is that a category that was not properly finished some decades ago has changed in the rhetorical ambient, the rhetorical environment of the legal thought as a kind of natural right and a right that is a constant presence in Western traditions. In addition, it's interesting to note how a category that barely survived in the world of European categories formations, and which was practically extinct from its medieval legality, was reinvigorated in the periphery, in the American space. What was fragile and non-existent in Europe was reborn in the enterprise of American slavery. So when the jurists of 19th century slavery proclaimed that the purple was essential to liberal European legality, they were referring to an institute that Europeans, with some exceptions like the Iberians, had practically not applied for centuries in their own territory since the Roman times. So I'm going to my conclusion. Understanding the ways in which legal knowledge is produced and why this produces demand and what is the rhetorical performance of its actors can reveal that this kind of knowledge, the legal knowledge, is formed in a complex process of transmission, of thought, but in a process of manipulation too. There's still a lot to be done in this field, and I hope that lawyers and legal researchers start to look more careful at in your work, the work about trying to discover the levels of knowledge and how the knowledge is produced. It's only through an understanding of how knowledge can be produced and manipulated that the law can be better understood. In doing so, we will be able to produce a more accurate knowledge about its history and its production. Thank you very much for your time today, and thank you for the organizer again.
Thank you very much for the very interesting lecture and insight into modifications of legal knowledge. Now, I would propose that if anyone has questions or remarks, please feel free to join into the discussion. It seems to me that the panel was very interesting. Does anyone have anything? Well, if not, then I would like to ask a question for Martin KUHAR. It was very interesting for me to see how the two fields of science, so psychiatric science and legal discipline interact. As I understand today, this is also where Paulo's profession would come into play, if he can also give some more insight into it. For all I understand today, the medical reports in courts are taken as granted. The medical science is not questioned. For what I understood in your presentation, Martin, it was not like that. Yes. So the medical professionals were questioned by the lawyers, and their reports were not taken as granted.
Yes, that is true. Forensic psychiatry was just starting to appear in Croatia at the time. That was one reason for that. The second reason was this rigidity of the criminal law that I stated, that either you were sane or insane. And yet, Žirocic had some cases which showed to him that the person was with less accountability, not complete unaccountability like schizophrenia, for example, but still he thought that the man was suffering from some sort of a psychiatric disturbance. And he couldn't really make a connection between his medical knowledge and some sort of a legal decree. And that was the reason. And he sometimes he tried to convince the courts to not give a life sentence, for example, for a murder. He tried to convince them, and he was basically a pioneer in this field, trying to position this his knowledge in forensic psychiatry as important for the court. To try to listen to them, but sometimes the courts basically ignored the reports by forensic psychiatrists. They received the report and they stated that they don't believe anything that is written there, and they made a decision regardless of the forensic report. So yes, you're right. It was the period when what I wanted to say was that it was the period when Lombroso and his theories were somewhat used in order to establish forensic psychiatry as a proper discipline. Yeah.
Thank you for your answer. I think it really shows how the historians of science need to take into account the circulation of knowledge between the disciplines and those implications for the formations of the disciplinary fields. Thank you. Any other questions or remarks maybe? Anyone wants to join in to the discussion? Well, if nobody, Vedran, please.
Yeah, I mean, I have a question/comment that just occurred to me while trying to link several of the talks in my head. I mean, since today appears to be the birthday of Charles Darwin, and then we kind of to see if we can combine several topics. Because it's Darwin's birthday today, then a small remark regarding the reception of Darwinism in different places. And Jan said that he kind of object to the steps overemphasis on the non-original science, non-original knowledge, right? That was one of your points of contention with it, which is kind of very interesting, because when you try to put things comparatively into perspective between, for instance, the Polish-speaking universities and the University of Zagreb, you will see really a very different type of reception of things such as Darwin's theory. In Croatian case, you don't see much debate about it. You see a lot of people disliking it, but how and why, that's a completely different thing. And it kind of brings me to Martin's talk. I think it just now occurred to me what possible main difference in explaining the very detailed discourse by the early eugenicists in Croatia and people debating Darwin is, it's basically, you know, their everyday knowledge. The dismissals or appraisals of Darwin's theory were very vague in Croatia, because very few people could have contributed anything to it in their daily work, whereas a larger number, I mean, 5 is a large number in Croatia of the early 20th century, a larger number of physicians could, through their daily work, form their opinions, whereas something as big as Darwin's theory appears as very vague and abstract. And then combining that to the Vojtěch's talk, I know we're learned to hate the neo-Lamarckists of the early 20th century, but in the 1920s, unless you were part of a very limited group of people who worked in Morgan's fly room, who knew about chromosomes as they were being discovered, for you it really did make sense to believe to be a Lamarckist. So it's all kind of linked in the end to the very fundamental issue of practice, and whether you do something or you just think about something in semi-peripheral cases means a lot as to what type of response to a scientific question you will articulate. So this was more of a monologue than a question, but again, it did make sense to try to link several of your talks.
Okay, Jan, would
you
like to
react a bit? It's just very short remark. I mean, I agree with what you said. I mean, my criticism, it's not really a criticism of STEP. It would maybe, I mean, what occurs to me is that STEP established peripheries or semi-periphery as a place in which not that much originality is happening, independent of Darwinism, positivism, whatever coming from the West. I mean, the whole vocabulary that STEP used was in most cases a vocabulary of dependency. And this is like
this is basically the only criticism I have. I mean, of course, it is productive what STEP did, and the questions that were proposed by STEP are very important. But it's, I mean, STEP also like stopped working 10 years ago, more or less. So, you know, we can start thinking much above STEP. And I think like, I mean, this, I mean, I had this example of the new book of interurban knowledge exchange, in which, let's say, the idea of exchange within the region was much more emphasized than the idea of, you know, being global in relation to Great Britain or whatever. So I would say that what seems to me now is important is actually to look at locality and different specialities of localities in relation to each other, and not always in relation to the epitomized West. Even on Darwin's birthday, we can, you know, talk about him all the time. Thanks.
Thank you. So if there are no further questions, I propose we take a 10-minute break and meet you again at 11:30 for the next panel. Thank you.